One of the greatest heroes of the Middle Ages, Richard the Lionheart, did not die by the sword of an enemy or in captivity, but by his own fatal mistake. What if I told you that his death wasn't just a result of battles and wounds, but a shocking error that threatened not only his life, but an entire empire? What nightmare did his final days become? Was his death really the way it's been depicted in stories, or was it much darker and more terrifying? Let's uncover this shocking secret together. In 1199, Richard the Lionheart, after years of war and bloodshed, remained one of the most fearsome warriors of his time. His name instilled fear in the hearts of his enemies, and his military exploits became legend. But even the mightiest can be broken. In the heart of France, during the siege of Châlons Castle, he sustained a wound that marked the beginning of the end. The arrow that pierced his arm seemed like a minor wound at first, but it was this wound that had fatal consequences. Instead of healing as usual, it became infected, and his body slowly lost its ability to fight. The disease that struck Richard began to reflect the same injustice that often accompanies the death of great heroes, something invisible on the battlefield. As the king battled pain and fever, his body could no longer endure. Gradually, he became weaker, and even his great spirit could not lift his body. With all his resources and a vast army, he was still doomed to defeat by something that could not be overcome with a sword. His story became not just about military victories, but also about defeat at the hands of an invisible death. Deep within his soul, an internal struggle began, not just with pain, but with despair. The great king, who had led his army to countless victories, now saw his forces consumed by this unseen evil. What could be worse for a warrior when his own body betrays him at the most crucial moment? The battlefield was no longer the only fight he could win. The true enemy was the painful process that was destroying him from the inside. Even though Richard the Lionheart continued to fight for his life, even lying in his bed, his will remained unbroken. Known for his unwavering resolve and ability to fight until the very end, he could not come to terms with the fact that death was drawing near. He had always been a leader, and now he was a man who, in the end, realized that this battle was one he would lose. The immense strength he had once displayed on the battlefield was no longer on his side. Lying in his bed, he demanded that all his orders be carried out, even when his body refused to obey him. Every touch to his wounds felt like unbearable pain, but in his eyes, the fire of determination still burned. He longed to leave a legacy, to ensure that his empire did not disappear when his body could no longer perform its function. However, even such an unyielding man as he could not deny the reality that surrounded him. The feeling of physical pain which gradually consumed him did nothing to support his morale. Richard felt his will weakening as he faced the inevitability of his fate. He began to realize that even his greatness could not reverse the course of events. The battlefield, where he had always felt strong and confident, was now absent. Confined to his bed, he faced the harshest battle of all, the struggle with his own body, which was refusing to serve him. With each new painful movement, he felt it harder to control his own life, his strength fading and despair tightening around his heart. Richard could not understand why this had happened to him. He, whose name had once struck fear across the continent, who was born on the battlefield and was a master in the art of war, was now imprisoned by his own helplessness. But even in this state, he refused to relinquish control. He gave orders, even when his voice cracked with pain, even when his body could no longer carry out his commands. He longed for his fight to continue, even when he understood that the empire he had built with blood and sweat would soon lose its great leader. His mind still delved into political affairs, just as it had when he fought for the crown. He felt like a powerless figure, but in his gaze was a pride that he had not forgotten his loyal subjects. However, his physical condition had become so critical that even this noble will could not manifest into reality. Every day, he felt more acutely how his condition worsened, and how the deadly consequences of his injury were taking a toll on him. His body was yielding to the laws of nature, and he was left with no choice but to accept his defeat. It was the moment when the indomitable leader, like any mortal man, was forced to face the inevitable end. Despite this, Richard remained unyielding even on the brink of death. His spirit would not allow him to break. He demanded that his closest advisors continue the fight, and even when strength abandoned him, he could not stop believing in his plans. He could not imagine being undone by such a trivial illness. In his soul, a spark of hope still burned, the hope that he could turn everything around. But the more pain he felt, the more it became clear that even this indomitable king could not defeat death. Every moment, every movement became a constant trial. He could not conquer the illness that had gripped his body, but his internal battle continued until his last breath. And though he seemed physically defeated, his will carried on, desperately trying to push his empire forward, even from the bed of death. He was not only a king, but also a symbol of strength and resilience, and even in the face of his own demise, he continued to remain that symbol. But no matter how hard he fought, death was stronger than his will. What began as a simple wound quickly turned into a deadly trap. When the arrow pierced Richard the Lionheart's shoulder, it marked the beginning of his inevitable demise. This was no mere injury. Although the early stages of the wound appeared insignificant, over time, due to blood loss and inadequate treatment, the first signs of gangrene began to appear. Within a few days, his condition sharply worsened. The doctors gathered around the king tried everything they could to save his life, but their efforts only prolonged the inevitable. Instead of healing, their actions merely slowed the inevitable demise. They attempted to cleanse the wound, applying herbs and special ointments, but the gangrene spread relentlessly. It consumed him, plunging him into a painful despair that slowly destroyed his body. For several days, Richard felt the excruciating pain of every touch to his wound, and his mind gradually realized that he was doomed. However, there was still a glimmer of hope in his heart, albeit faint. This battle between life and death raged within him, as he tried desperately to escape the clutches of gangrene that consumed his body. His fingers began to blacken and rot, the initial signs that his body was responding to the infection. The situation became increasingly critical, and even his doctors could feel their hope fading. The longer time passed, the more Richard could sense these horrific changes within his body. The finger that first failed him became a symbol of his suffering, blackened, cold, severed from the rest of his body. This terrifying process took an even darker turn when he began to experience symptoms of sepsis, a deadly infection spreading throughout his system. Although at this time the doctors tried to treat him using primitive methods, they were unable to comprehend the full scale of the disease ravaging the king. Gangrene slowly transformed Richard, and he lost the strength and greatness that had once made him a fearsome warrior on the battlefield. The constant pain Richard endured grew increasingly unbearable, and his body, which had once withstood the fiercest of battles, now rebelled against him and yielded to the disease. It was not just physical suffering, it was moral suffering too, as a man who had never feared death now found himself the helpless victim of a merciless disease that no one could cure. Even in such a state, the king continued to hold his kingdom in his grasp, filled with determination. But the more he tried to maintain control, the more it became clear the end was inevitable. And though it was a slow and agonizing process, observed by all his subjects, his will to fight remained. This tragic process was not just his physical fall, but the fall of the very idea he had fought for throughout his life. As his body failed him, so too did the world he had built. And in his final moments, it became clear that death did not just take his body, it took all of his greatness. As Richard fought for his life, his brother John had already begun preparing to claim the throne. John, who had always felt overshadowed by Richard, saw this situation as an opportunity to seize everything he had longed for. Knowing that Richard was on the brink of death, he started manipulating those around him, gaining support from influential barons and loyal knights. While the king suffered from the inevitable death, John worked on his strategy, plotting to take the power that had long eluded him. John was a man who knew how to calculate each of his moves with precision. Through his manipulation and cunning, he drew important figures to his side, convincing them that his reign would be more beneficial for England than the ongoing quarrels with the king. As Richard grew weaker and weaker, John gained more freedom to act, simultaneously attracting those willing to shift their loyalty for the sake of stability and retaining power. Even though Richard remained king, the mere fact of his deteriorating condition already created a power vacuum. Everyone knew that Richard's decisions were now less influential, as his physical capabilities began to diminish. His numerous orders and directives could no longer be carried out with the same force as before. John saw this as his moment, and began putting his own interests above those of the kingdom, knowing that Richard's death would only mark the beginning of a fierce struggle for the throne. It was during this time, when death was already inevitable, that political intrigue began, questioning the very idea of the kingdom's unity. Although John outwardly behaved as a loyal brother, he had a clear goal: to become king by eliminating all obstacles in his path. At this time, even some of Richard's advisors began to shift their allegiance, seeing John as a more stable and advantageous alternative. The games John played were not mere strategic moves on his path to power. These were manipulations designed to deceive not only enemies, but also his own allies. While Richard still held on to his crown, John was actively cultivating political connections and making deals that, upon Richard's death, would allow him to take control of the situation. Furthermore, some barons had already begun to doubt whether it was worth supporting Richard until the end of his days. They started to openly look toward John, seeing in him the potential to take leadership. Meanwhile, Richard, though still king, was forced to watch the power struggle unfold, even as he was nearly paralyzed by his illness. His power seemed more and more illusory, for the battle had long ceased to be solely political. Its rules were dictated by the intrigues and cruelty of his closest relatives. John did not hide his ambitions. He disregarded the oath of loyalty he had sworn to Richard when he was in his prime. Now, with the king reduced to a mere shadow of himself, John saw endless possibilities before him. The political game was in full swing, and even Richard's death couldn't stop his progress, as each of John's moves was strengthened by disinformation and psychological manipulation. At this moment, it became clear that not only Richard's death, but also the events surrounding it would be a serious test for the state. During his final moments on the English throne, political intrigues took on forms that showed little respect for the king himself. In his final moments, Richard, so accustomed to battles and executions, could no longer fight. His weary body no longer obeyed his will, and his mind, once sharp and resolute, was now held captive by death. Lying on his bed, dying from the terrible infection caused by the wound from an arrow to his arm, Richard continued to demand his orders be carried out. His eyes, clouded by pain, still burned with an indomitable will. Although he had no strength left, he could feel himself losing everything he had built over the years. However, this was not yet the end of his power. Despite his impending death, its consequences quickly became the subject of political manipulation and power struggles. Richard, like many great rulers, died not only as a person, but also as a symbol, ready to become a tool in the hands of those eager to claim the throne. In these final hours, as the king felt his life force slipping away, intrigues began to emerge that left behind all previous rivalries. His brother John knew this was his chance. Behind him were years of bitterness and a desire to be king. When Richard lost his ability to govern, John began actively manipulating the situation. In Richard's last days, the king became nothing but a symbol, while the real battle for the throne was fought by his brother, who, while the king was dying, began shifting the loyalties of allies and manipulating various factions in the kingdom. Richard's death became the beginning of a new political stage, one where there was no room for sympathy for his elder brother. John was not alone in wanting to exploit Richard's death. Other influential figures, advisors, and barons also began to act. Everyone knew that after the death of the great king, control over the empire would need to be quickly established. There was no room for compromise. Richard, who had only days earlier been victorious in battles, and a conqueror, suddenly became nothing more than a pawn in a political game. As difficult as it was, his death was needed to achieve a clear goal: stability in the kingdom through a new ruler. Political manipulations became not just simple attempts to seize the throne, but a fight to redistribute power in England following Richard's death. Although the king had an old ally in the form of barons and high commanders, in reality, no one was certain who could carry the empire forward. Several factions began to collaborate actively, relying on the support of those who had witnessed Richard's final moments and were now thinking about how to use them to their advantage. Soon after Richard passed from this world, the barons likely held several secret meetings where decisions about the kingdom's new political structure were made with little regard for the idea of royal succession. Instead of placing Richard's heir on the throne, who should have naturally continued his political legacy, Richard left behind nothing but a vacuum, one that manipulators were ready to fill with their own ambitions. If it was difficult to imagine that the death of Richard the Lionheart would have such deep consequences for English politics, the days following his death quickly revealed how his legacy would become nothing more than a subject of struggle for the throne. The death of the great monarch not only deprived him of the ability to continue ruling, but also opened the door to new conflicts, where political manipulations became the primary tool for those aiming to secure their own power. Richard the Lionheart's death marked the beginning of a political battle that changed the course of English history. John, his brother, was ready to seize the moment. All possible mechanisms of manipulation were employed, and even the kingdom, which should have rested on Richard's values and plans, began to crack. The death of the monarch changed everything. Those who remained in power sought to hold it in their hands for as long as possible. The death of Richard the Lionheart became the climax of his great life. But it was at this moment that the decline of England under the rule of his brothers began. During his reign, the country had been united into a powerful empire, but everything changed after his death. Richard left behind a huge legacy, including military achievements, conquered territories, and political strength. However, the king's death marked the beginning of a new chapter in history, one defined by political instability and a fierce battle for power. Internal intrigues and the struggle for the crown became the dominant theme of this period, and England seemed to fall into a labyrinth of political chaos. The empire that Richard the Lionheart had built with his own hands experienced severe shocks as his heirs began a ruthless fight for the throne. His brother John, using the situation, began to capture strategically important positions, seeking to consolidate his power. But political intrigues were not confined only to the struggle between the king's relatives. Moreover, England, unprepared for such internal division, faced numerous conspiracies and incitement among high-ranking officials and barons who had their own ambitions. Richard's death did not just initiate the battle for the crown, but destroyed the balance within the state, becoming the cause of a political struggle that would engulf the country for many years to come. Despite Richard's recognition as a great king, his death brought more chaos than stability. His absence left a huge political gap that his successors could not fill. This not only created an opportunity for external threats, but also for manipulations within the country. John, who became the successor, tried to suppress any opposition and strengthen his power, but even he could not suppress the wave of discontent that swept across the people. From that moment, a new phase began in English history, where political intrigues became the cornerstone of power, and the country faced numerous crises, the consequences of which would be felt for decades. Richard's death also turned out to be a moment of rupture for England. His death became a metaphor for the country's fragmentation, where unity and strength were no longer present. Among those vying for the throne, there was no singular vision for England's future. The political landscape shifted, and each ruler after Richard, though ambitious, could never restore the stability the country had under his reign. The years following Richard's death became a period of fighting for the right to the throne, with those in power using various means to maintain their position. Yet none of them managed to secure the unity and strength that Richard the Lionheart had once embodied. As a result, Richard's death left not only a political struggle behind, but also deep cultural consequences. His legacy was burdened by constant attempts to manipulate his image and achievements, and the period following his death became a search for the ideal figure who could restore the empire. Yet, even the greatest politicians in England could not bring the country back to the powerful form it had under his reign. Richard the Lionheart. Was he a hero or a victim of his cruel empire? His life and death leave behind more questions than answers. When we look at the legacy of this great king who left a huge mark in history, it's hard not to notice how his death became not only a political, but a moral catastrophe for England. He was a hero, but at the same time a victim of his time, his ambitious politics, and even the brutal empire he built. Richard's final days, filled with physical suffering and the fight for life, became something much bigger than just the tragic end of one king. It was a moment that changed the course of history. His death was not just the end of a monarch's life. It was a moment that created a chasm at the very heart of England. Richard was not just a symbol of strength and grandeur, he was the embodiment of what it meant to rule in the context of ruthless politics and war. He united England through battles and conquests, but his death left it torn apart. And while his legacy is enormous, it's more like a canvas where every stroke carries tragedy and the flames of battle. Now, as history has etched these events, we ask ourselves, was Richard's death simply the end of his life? Or was it a climactic moment that had to unravel all the knots in England's history? How did his death impact England? What happened when the last hero of Great Britain lost the same fearless spirit that had driven the country to glory and victories? How did the politics and intrigues within the court of this great ruler reflect in the battle for the crown? Is it possible that in his final days, Richard still had hope for victory? Perhaps his death became the beginning of a new order, one that eventually tore apart the empire he had so carefully built. Was this process inevitable? And did his death serve as the catalyst for all the events that followed? Richard the Lionheart left behind not only great conquests and victories, but also shocking moments of political intrigue and a struggle for power among his successors. Although his crown was passed on, the battle for his legacy became a source of chaos for the country. After his death, England struggled to find someone who could rule with the same decisiveness and success. Only recently has it become clear how the deaths of great leaders are often given various interpretations, each of which weighs heavily on the political decisions and ambitions of their heirs. And here, after his life was cut short, the question of what actually happened became open. Perhaps we will never know why Richard the Lionheart died so early, and why his death became such a significant political fracture for England. Richard was a great military commander, and his death had an impact not only on England, but on the entire world of his time. His departure left not only a void at the heart of the state, but also a shocking realization of how power could turn into weakness. While many of his predecessors and successors were forced to fight for his empire, Richard remained a symbol of dignity and strength. But over time, we begin to realize that these moments when we view a person as an invincible hero can become a tragedy for future generations. And so hundreds of years later, we once again turn to Richard's death to reflect on how one death changed the course of history, how the loss of human will became a crossroads for entire nations. Why did the death of this great king leave such a massive gap in history? And why are we still trying to unravel the political labyrinths of his final days? The questions remain unanswered. Could his death have been part of a larger plan? Or was it simply the tragedy of one man broken by intrigue and politics? Is there more to this than just the story of a king's death? And will we ever be able to definitively solve these mysteries and learn what truly happened in Richard the Lionheart's final moments? These questions remain in the dark, and only time can reveal why the death of this great king left such a huge void in history.